and welcome to the UMDF podcast. I'm Phil Yeske, Science and Alliance Officer at the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, and I will be your moderator for today's podcast. Today, we're going to talk about how the experience of people living with mitochondrial disease helps shape research. Like, we often think about research in terms of laboratories, clinical trials, scientific data, but increasingly, we've come to realize that high impact, valuable research begins by understanding what patients experience in their daily life. What matters most to them? What meaningful improvement would actually look like to the patients? That's what we're going to explore in today's podcast. And I'm really fortunate to be joined by a group of panelists today to help facilitate this discussion. Our first panelist is Christy Klein. Please join Christy. She is Senior Director and Head of Patient Advocacy at Pharming. Christy has spent many years working with patients and families in the rare disease space. She recently presented work at the Mitochondrial Medicine Conference in Orlando that captured the lived experience of people with mitochondrial disease. And so we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that today with her. So welcome, Christy.
Thank you for the opportunity. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you with us. Next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Danielle Black. She is the Clinical Research Coordinator at UMDF. Danielle has been with us all of about 6 months now, but really excited to have her on board. With us, Danielle oversees natural history studies, clinical research conducted through our patient registry, Mitoshare. So we're going to touch on all of those topics in today's podcast. She has spent the past decade coordinating clinical research in a hospital environment, working directly with patients, families, clinicians, and researchers. So she really brings a valuable perspective. Danielle, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Magnus Hansen, Vice President and Clinical Development Head for Pharming. Magnus is a physician scientist who has worked in mitochondrial disease research and therapeutic development for many years. Amazingly, Magnus and I first met each other back in 2014 at a UMDF Mitochondrial Medicine Conference. Where does the time go by, Magnus? But great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Phil. Yeah, really glad to be here, and thanks for organizing this panel.
Yes, of course. Okay, let's jump in with the conversation. Christy, I'm going to begin with you. There's sort of three buckets that I'd like to cover today in this podcast. The first is listening to the patients. All right, so why begin by listening? And Christy, when people hear the term medical research, they usually think about laboratories, clinical trials, or what I said, in the opening comments. But you did some work and presented it at the UMDF conference just a few weeks ago that began somewhat different. Right, you started by asking patients to describe everyday life and mitochondrial disease and what that's like. Why was it important to begin there?
Thanks, Phil. I've really spent my career working along patients and families, many of them living with rare disease. And one thing I've really learned is that patients are the true experts living with their disease. Physicians can see patients a few times a year. Researchers collect, data during studies. But patients really live with the disease every single day. And it was important for us to understand what happens during those other 8,700 hours of the year when a patient's not sitting in an exam room. What are some of the challenges they face? What decisions are they having to make? And what do they wish people understood better? I think one of our goals wasn't just to document symptoms and learn about those symptoms. It was to understand how they really affect their lives.
Yeah, I really like this idea of the other 8,700 hours, right? I think that's really important. And it sort of drives home the fact that the actual time spent, right, in interactions between patient and clinician is but a small portion. That's less than 1%, right, of the time in any given year. So, kind of based on that, it's easy to realize that it's really on the patients, their caregivers, the families. They're the ones managing the disease 99% of the time. So we need to talk to them, right? Or we're missing a large part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things that we really wanted to, it was important to create a safe space for patients to be able to share their stories and to share what they're going through on a daily basis. We're not just handing them a checklist and saying, can you rate your symptoms from 1 to 10? We wanted to hear in their own words what living with mitochondrial disease feels like. And some of those conversations did get emotional. Patients spoke and shared with us about some of their fatigue, mobility, cognitive challenges, relationships, and even the uncertainty that really comes with never knowing what tomorrow can look like. I think one of the things that really became clear is while everyone had a different experience and they were all unique, there were a lot of consistent themes that we heard throughout the time speaking with patients.
Yeah, I think that's a really important component of your work that you conducted, that it was more free-forming, allowing patients to talk. Like if we try to reduce this down to just a checklist of symptoms, you're really constraining the conversation, right? So, approaching it from more of a tell us what you're experiencing and in a broad way, right? The symptoms and the challenges that you face, as a patient. That's how we're going to get the best information, right? To inform research.
100%. I think even when you think about that, like fatigue, we hear a lot of people talk about fatigue,
Yes.
But it wasn't that patients just weren't talking about being tired. They really described in a different way how they have to sometimes budget their energy.
Yes.
And, everyday activities that we do or think about, like we don't even think twice about having to take a shower or go grocery shopping or make dinner. For some of the people that we learned, that requires planning. And, even after they do some of those tasks, some people described how it takes hours or even days for them to recover. I think one of the things that really stood out the most to me was one patient compared it to having a battery that never fully recharges. One person told us about how what they could do one thing today, but it might cost them the next 2 days where they won't be able to do anything. And I think that really, really illustrated for me how mitochondrial disease shapes some of their daily decision making.
Yeah, again, very important concept, this idea of energy budgeting, all right? That's, most of us make choices about how we spend our time without necessarily thinking about what that means in terms of energy associated with it, right? But for mitochondrial disease patients, they have to make very deliberate choices, right? About prioritizing given a limited amount of time where they may have sufficient energy, or recognizing that this extreme fatigue might come on and not allow them to accomplish what it is they want to accomplish. So that may come at a significant cost later, right? If they try to overextend themselves. So, Danielle, I want to bring you into the conversation here because Christy's introduced this concept of what I'll call mitochondrial fatigue, right? It's a different kind of fatigue, all right? That's not just what, let's say, a non-affected person, might experience on a day-to-day basis. But like, what have we learned from the patient community about mitochondrial fatigue in various forms?
Yeah, I want to kind of piggyback off what Chrissy was saying, like you said, and I think we did a Voice of the Patient report survey back in 2019, and we got some great feedback, but kind of all of the stories kind of gave the same message. So we want to share a quote with you, and I think the main points that stood out from this quote were that Mito seems to reinvent the word fatigue. So the main two things in this quote were, it's impossible to chew, that's something that we don't think about on a daily basis, or, there's cinder blocks taped to your eyelids. It's like you can't even just kind of be able to go through the daily functions. So I think in my experience as well, it was that limitation that caused such turmoil to these patients, to not be able to take their kids to school or things like that we really take advantage of on a daily basis.
Yeah, I encourage our viewers. We've put the quote on the screen to take that in, to think about the words, right, that the patient is sharing there. This Voice of Patient report is enduring material. It came out of our 2019 externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that we conducted together with the FDA, primarily focused on mitochondrial disease patients with myopathy, with muscle-related symptoms. So we've heard about fatigue, we've heard about exercise intolerance, muscle weakness, things that definitely impact mobility, and other topics we'll talk about going forward. But encourage you to find those resources on the UMDF website. Hopefully we've been able to provide a link to you here on screen as well, where to find those. But this explanation, right, the context you provided there, Danielle, it really begins to help connect the biology, the science, right, with the lived patient experience, and why we can't just ask someone simply, do you feel tired? Because that doesn't begin, to describe what this mitochondrial fatigue represents. So we have to think about it more in terms of how that affects function, recovery, and choices that our patients make throughout the day. So I think that really important concept, and thanks for sharing that quote. Christy, I'm going to bounce back to you. One of the things that stood out to me in your poster was that patients didn't usually talk about symptoms in isolation, right? It's a pattern. It's how many different symptoms all relate together. So what did you learn in this regard?
Yeah, that's something that really was eye-opening to us. Patients rarely said, "Oh, my muscle weakness is getting worse." That sometimes that's what people measure. But the words that they used were things like, "I can't carry groceries anymore," or "I've had to stop working," or we even heard, "I don't have enough energy to play with my children." Another phrase was, "I had to choose between going to work or spending time with my family." Those are very different conversations and really help remind us that, mitochondrial disease affects so much more than just muscles or energy production.
Right.
It can affect their identity and their independence. So, for some people, it's even their ability to participate in life and life activities.
Yeah, it just reinforces the earlier comment that it's not about a list of symptoms in isolation, but it's how all those symptoms come together uniquely, right, for each patient, and how that impacts their ability to participate in family life, how they work, right? Sometimes how they even see themselves. So that's great information that really informs impactful research then going forward. How do we address these aspects that the patients themselves are telling us are most important to them? So that aspect of your work is really appreciated. There was also an aspect of unpredictability, right? So this is not a disease necessarily that's consistent and in one way or a baseline. It may be improving, it may be getting worse, right, at any time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you may have been able to pull out from your conversations around that aspect, unpredictability.
Yeah, I think those were some of the harder conversations even to hear when you hear patients talk about how they were trying to learn to live a new life with their symptoms. Very different sometimes than what they had envisioned for themselves. We had, one patient that really described losing a career that they loved. And then another person really shared that they no longer recognize themselves physically. As many of you know, some of them talked even about becoming dependent on others or family members. And really, those stories and people being willing to share those with us helped us understand this disease burden that numbers never will be able to do. So.
Yeah, there's so many aspects to it. Right? You can imagine there's a fear of disappointing the people around you, right? The anxiety, right, alone of just not knowing, is today a good day or a bad day? More fatigue, less fatigue. That's truly a burden in and of itself, and an important component of what the lived experience is for mitochondrial disease patients. Please go ahead.
I'll just add one other thing. I think a lot of them really had this almost fear and worry about disappointing others. That unpredictability that you talked about earlier, that alone creates the anxiety in addition to some of the physical challenges that they have. So, they were afraid to make plans with family or friends because they didn't know if they'd have enough energy to be able to participate.
Yes. So, Danielle, maybe I'll come back to you for this question. We're hearing about the importance of listening to the patient, the kind of data, information we can collect. But what are some of the ways that organizations like ours or sponsors, perhaps working in therapeutic development, can interact with patients to gather this kind of information? What sort of forums exist for that?
Yeah, there's multiple forums that exist. So things like us with our organization, we do a lot of surveys. We have our Mitoshare patient registry that allows us to collect information that is so valuable. There's natural history studies that are either ran by organizations or sponsors. And then ones that we may not talk about very often are the patient-focused groups for like drug development and listening sessions with the FDA. So it really adds that personal touch that, agencies and, bigger groups may not look at each day, but they're invaluable.
Yeah, I really appreciate your mentioning these interactions with the FDA. Already earlier, I mentioned the 2019 patient-focused drug development meeting. That was the first, as far as I know, in the mitochondrial disease space, but it certainly hasn't been the last, right? And even at the time, I can recall us saying, this is not the end station, right? This is the first station on the train ride of better understanding the patient perspective in mitochondrial disease and what that means for therapeutic development. That's really proven to be the case. Even through the pandemic into the more recent years, there have been other patient-focused drug development meetings. There have been listening sessions, which tend to be a smaller, more controlled conversation. But on all of them, the FDA personnel are there listening and learning. And this really helps them when it comes time to review a sponsor's submission as part of a new drug application. They're not just seeing the efficacy data and the safety data, very important, but they have this other layer of information, right, to apply against that too. So what have the patients told us is important to them? What benefit, what risk are they willing to take for a given benefit? And so all of this information flows into that, and that hopefully makes the review process a lot more robust. So thanks for calling it out. And again, on the UMDF website, these are all meant to be enduring materials. You don't just do it and put them away. Keep them up so that the community can access them, but also industry that may be interested in coming into the space can access them. And importantly, regulators can access them as well. So Christy, at the end of the day, kind of through all of this, if you had to summarize, what did the patients say they need more than anything else? What were the clearest messages that emerged?
Yeah, I think that was probably some of the most hopeful part of the conversations we had with them, because they didn't just describe some of the problems. They were really talking about solutions and things that there was a greater need for. We heard about a greater need for awareness among healthcare providers, even better access to supportive therapies, including mental health support, but really, a better understanding from employers and family members and even society. But I think the most important thing was they wanted researchers and clinicians to continue listening to them.
Yes, incredibly important. In fact, I think back to a first patient registry that I was involved with at UMDF called the Mitochondrial Disease Community Registry. Not as scientifically rigorous and robust as our current registry, Mitoshare, and Danielle and I are going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. But we did a lot of open-ended questions and just tried to capture their patients' thoughts on things. And one of the clearest messages was, I don't feel like I'm being listened to. Right? And so we actually published a paper on this that we can share a link to as well, that just captures all the different ways patients shared this central message of, sometimes I just feel like nobody understands me. I'm not being listened to. And that leaves them feeling removed, right, from the process of what the disease they're experiencing, but also what therapies may exist for them, right, going forward. So really important topic. So I would say this probably transitions us to the second major topic I wanted to cover in today's podcast, and that's now turning this patient experience into research, right? How do patients' experiences become scientific questions. So Magnus, thank you for your patience, but this is where I really want to bring you into the conversation here. So now that we have this understanding, what happens next, right? How do these experiences like fatigue, limited mobility, loss of independence, how can those be addressed in an actual scientific clinical study?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I actually think we are taking this conversation in the right order, right? Because we really need to start with the patient insights. But because the challenge we have as drug development scientists is to translate that scientific hope of a new mechanism of action, new compound, into something that is meaningful for a patient. And then in the context of a clinical trial, yes, it needs to be meaningful, but it also needs to be something that we actually can measure. So something measurable and something that is reliable. And that may seem trivial, but it is quite a task, right? So traditionally, it may have been more focus on something that is like purely measurable, such as a blood test, and also some other measures. And those tests are very useful to understand the overall disease. But especially in mitochondrial disease, where fatigue is such a prevalent theme, we really need to be mindful that we ask the right question, because we need to prioritize quite tough when we design a clinical trial. So while we have may focused historically on tests such as, one example is the 6-minute walk test that has been used quite a lot in various clinical settings and also historically in mitochondrial disease. And that gives you a number, right? But it's important that it's accurate of the patient experience and that it really reflects how a patient feels and functions. So our goal is really to bring the different perspectives together, what is meaningful, what is reliable, and what can be measured. And there we really need to start with the patient experience first.
Yeah, it's really about finding a balance, right, between this scientific need for objectivity, being able to measure something objectively, right, and translate that into something that ultimately could be used to help convince a regulator that there's meaningful change, right, taking place. But there's this very important, more subjective component to it, right, of how the patient feels and functions, and so capturing data around that. So I think you would agree that sort of the best clinical research is taking place now balances these two things, right, bringing in the patient perspective alongside these objective clinical measures.
Exactly, and I'm glad that the way you phrase it, because yes, sometimes we want something objectively, but we can also measure the subjective, because how you feel is a subjective experience, and what we've heard is that experience is really key. So, I mean, we may see a laboratory measure that may improve, and we may take like an imaging study, like a radiograph, see how something looks in the body, but sometimes they are more or less disconnected from the patient experience. And often what we hear when we actually listen is to get insights into something which is more practical, like how will that energy deficiency, how will that translate, and can we improve that? So how does it affect everyday life activities? And will I be able to spend more time or enough time with my family, friends, or simply being able to get out of the house? And can I or will I be able to continue work or take care of my activities such as household chores? So those are, of course, extremely meaningful outcomes from the individual's perspective.
Yeah, I think back, Magnus, this is a big change, right? Like clinical research in mitochondrial disease has been going on for about 2 decades. But we just had first approvals within the last year. So there's a lot of learning and a lot of testing that's taken place, across these years. And to me, this is a really meaningful change that's occurred from singular reliance on selecting outcome measures, right, around scientific measurement, right, and not necessarily incorporating what's most important for the patient. And so we've watched multiple sponsors across multiple domains, multiple types of mitochondrial disease begin to incorporate these important secondary outcome measures that really help to understand what's most important to the patient alongside the objective measurement. So that's a good thing. And we still have work to do on both fronts, right? In terms of there's still a lot to explore and understand with the patients, but we clearly have a need for better, more robust measurements, right? Objective measurements of clinical improvement too, because ultimately they're both going to be important in the context of investigative therapies. So Christy, so kind of thinking about how the scientific world has changed over that time, again, because you worked in many different diseases across your career, rare diseases, how have you seen the interactions between patient advocacy groups and sponsors change across that time?
Yeah, I think that's one of the greatest rewards that I have seen is how the patient advocacy groups and the patients have gotten more involved in influencing research by sharing their thoughts and what's important to them. They're not just telling us what their lives are like. They're really trying to help people understand what a meaningful improvement, which is what many things are measured on, could look like and what that would mean to them. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And the more that we can continue to involve patients earlier in the research, the better.
Yes. I think that early aspect, right, is really something worth emphasizing here. Like it's never too soon to engage the patient community, either through patient advocacy groups, focus groups, whatever it may be, to begin collecting that lived experience, right, the patient voice. Even if your clinical development plan, right, isn't necessarily clear yet. And so that's what certainly at UMDF, we try to facilitate these early strategic partnerships with anybody considering coming into the space to ensure that the patient remains at the center of whatever plans come out of that. So I'm glad that you've observed that change too. As I think about back across my career, I've certainly seen that change quite a bit, and that's a change for the positive as well. So Magnus, maybe to begin to put a wrap on this aspect of the podcast, like we've talked a lot about mitochondrial disease, the need to have the patient experience alongside these, but why fundamentally is mitochondrial disease so difficult? What are the aspects of it that make it a challenge, right, to design clinical research studies and ultimately develop therapies?
Yeah, there are many challenges, but what I particularly think is one major challenge, especially for mitochondrial diseases, is the pure number of symptoms that patients have. I mean, we are all slightly different from each other, even though we have the same driving forces and the same needs, but each patient have this unique combination of symptoms, and therefore, as I said earlier, it's really important for us to really focus, because there would be numerous things that we could measure in a clinical trial, but we really need to look at what is really most important from the patient perspective and try to find common themes so that we can have a sufficient number of patients in a trial, because often what we end up with is putting a number or something and then measuring something that is how something on average change in a study population. And therefore it's really critical with that clinical study design early in mind. And I think we mentioned it a couple of times here already, the patient voice from 2019, that was really instrumental in how we originally shaped our program, to really put at the front the prioritized symptoms from a bigger population, so that we could develop a study which could actually ask what we think are really relevant questions from the patient perspective, and then develop meaningful outcomes around those themes.
Yeah, the complexity of mitochondrial disease, well documented. Again, as I reflect, I think for a long time, this community, not just the patients, even the clinicians and the researchers involved in it, the patient advocacy group, patient advocates too, it wore this complexity almost as a badge of honor. Look at this disease. It's really complicated. Like you can't understand it. It's from a biology perspective, the lived experience, many different perspectives. And, for some time, right, I've been trying to advocate in very public forums that we need to transition to, we acknowledge the complexity of it, but this is our roadmap, right? We're telling you, these are the challenges we face. These are the things we need to work on, right? One at a time or in parallel to learn more about this aspect. And that cumulatively, then we begin to have a much broader understanding of mitochondrial disease. And we don't have to talk as much about why it's really difficult. It is difficult. There's no question about it. Many diseases are difficult. But it's about taking something complex, breaking it down into understanding the component challenges, and then designing programs or studies, right, to address each one of those. So I know your company, you briefly mentioned it, is actively in clinical development for an investigational therapy right now called the Falcon study. Maybe just briefly, how did patient perspective influence the creation of the Falcon study?
Yeah, it had a fundamental impact. So looking back at that patient voice report from 2019, but also a lot of conversations we have after that, and the work that Christy has led and presented earlier this year really highlights that a large proportion of patients, this fatigue, this really debilitating fatigue that is, we saw a quote here earlier, but also muscle weakness, that those are really impactful on the quality of life, but also on the independence of people. So we decided early on to focus this study on both of those aspects, right? One measure being more objective and one inherently subjective, but both, if we and we were really mindful in developing endpoints so we actually could have reliable measures for both of those themes, both for the muscle weakness and the fatigue, and being able to include patients in a trial that have multiple symptoms, but at least requiring that those two components are existing, and they are in the overwhelming majority of patients.
Now, this is a great example of asking, listening, and translating it into action, right? Into designing the study. So kudos for that. That's exactly the kind of connection, right, that we're trying to describe and capture so that others can take this same approach, going forward. Now, the Falcon study is a placebo-controlled study, and this is often a question we get from patients, like, why would there need to be a placebo involved when I have the disease, right? So maybe you can just briefly touch on the importance of including a placebo in a trial like the Falcon study.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because often the placebo-controlled study design, it is really the highest standard of evidence when we do clinical studies. And in the end, when we do a clinical study, we want the data to be of a quality so that others can really evaluate it. And often that means looking at many different people and then being able to draw conclusions from that. And as we said, every person is different, right? So every person will have slightly different versions of the symptoms. So one part is to develop the endpoints that are reliable and something to measure. But then when we apply those, so placebo control actually means there are actually two important components. One is this placebo, which is the same type of treatment that has the active component. So often, let's say there's a tablet. So a tablet with the active component, and then an identical tablet, which looks the same, feels the same, tastes the same, but it lacks that investigational treatment that you're evaluating. So if you have that component in a study, then the person taking the study drug, but also the physician and us, we have no way of being biased. So bias is an important concept when the regulators evaluate the clinical study. And there can be many reasons for bias, and often it's unconscious. So one component is to have that placebo, so an inactive version of the study drug. And the other part is that it's randomized, that you don't decide that, well, this patient is probably going to benefit a little bit more, so I will assign this treatment and this person this treatment. Then you will have that bias. So that randomized control part is the other second component. And really, to get the best level of evidence, to really make sure that a study drug is effective and is safe, it's really state of the art for how to evaluate. But it can be a challenge, especially in rare disease, because there are a limited number of patients. So sometimes we're not able to do it. But for some of the more common symptoms and patient populations, and since we are studying adults with fatigue and myopathy, among other symptoms, we are able to do that placebo-controlled study design. And it's important to bear in mind that that is often the best and most reliable way to really get to know, does a compound truly work and is it truly safe or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about, to the best of your ability, removing both conscious and unconscious bias, right, in how you design the study. But the human brain is very powerful, and if you believe, right, that you're taking something, even if you're not, you may experience or believe you experience improvements. And so good studies have to be able to tease this out. And as a scientist, we often talk about signal and noise, right? So being able to find the signal, what the real clinical benefit is, apart from the noise of just the change in the disease, but also what may be anecdotal or perceived change, not true clinical change. It's complex, not easy. And as you said, in any rare disease, when you're dealing with small numbers, it's hard to sufficiently power, that is, recruit enough patients, right, into these studies to be able to reduce the noise and increase the signal. Great backdrop. We could have a whole separate podcast just around good clinical trial design and maybe how that's changing going forward. We'll file that one away for a future idea. But maybe kind of one final questions here around clinical research. What is the one thing you would want the patients or patient families listening to this podcast to know about clinical research?
Well, I think what we really try to highlight here is how the focus really have changed, and how we have really tried to change focus. Instead of looking at a compound, which you may do as scientists, that clinical study should really begin with the most important question in mind. So what matters from a patient, who is the ultimate person who may benefit from that treatment? Start with that question rather than from the compound perspective.
Yeah, perfectly articulated, right? Start with the question, not what you think the answer is, right? This is a lesson that we could all apply in life broadly, but it's really important in therapeutic development, right? What's the right question to put forward? And the only way to know the right question to put forward is to listen, right, to the people that you're really hoping to help with any therapy. So, Danielle, let's bring it back to daily life, right? You've had the opportunity to work with patient families in a clinical setting. You interact with families, patients and families here at UMDF in your role. What have you heard? What has been your experience in interacting with those very important stakeholders, patients, patient families, around fatigue, physical function? What does that actually mean to them in terms of their daily life?
It really means everything to them. So, as we discussed before, these patients with mitochondrial disease have to have an energy budget. They have to manage their time and how much energy they can use. So we're going to throw up another quote. And I think what really stood out to me in this one was when they said, "I'm just grateful for days when I have the mental energy to make a grocery list." That may seem like something none of us want to do on a daily basis, but to feel grateful to be able to do that, I mean, it says it all about how this disease population can be affected. And I think the main thing with me working in a pediatric environment, the children aren't always able to voice the disappointment and not being able to do things with their peers or their family members or things like that. So it was really for me working with the parents to understand what they saw and try to improve things for both the patient and the parent to kind of have that freedom and independence with energy in their lives.
Yeah, I think anybody working in patient advocacy has experienced this as well in their interactions with the patient and patient family community. It just reinforces that these symptoms impact not just them health-wise, medically, right? But it's the relationship with their family, their ability to work, right? Or living, their identity, right? Their own identity and what they represent externally as well. So it's really across so many different domains, and you can't really summarize it in a single number, can you, right? It's important to sort of look at the totality of it. All right, so maybe with the time we have remaining, we'll transition to a third part of the conversation, and that's the importance of learning from the patients, listening to the patients, not just once, but over time, right? So this concept of longitudinal capture of data. There's many different aspects of UMDF programming associated with this. We've helped or tried to facilitate the creation of an ecosystem to capture data and capture it over time. So maybe let's start with what I view as the most important program that UMDF facilitates, and that's our patient registry, Mitoshare. So Danielle, let's bring it up to a high level first, and just can you briefly describe what is a patient registry? What are the goals of it? Some of our audience members may not fully understand that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important place to start. So a patient registry is a database that is structured to follow people with a certain disease or condition. So obviously for ours, we follow patients with mitochondrial disease. So it allows us to document their disease and condition over time. And with that information, it helps researchers to understand what real world outcomes that they're going through each day, symptoms, and it's a place to see where we can start to improve care overall. And then for ours specifically, I think it's important to note that within the mitochondrial disease population, the diagnostic journey is not the same for everybody. So we include people that either do have a genetic confirmation for mitochondrial disease or, just a clinical diagnosis with symptoms. So we want to include everyone because we know everybody's journey is different with mitochondrial disease.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. That is a really important description, and generally around registries. And of course, for Mitoshare, we want to be able to share with our audience the link to get more information about it, how you can participate in it, absent an engaged patient community, particularly one where we have hundreds of different types of mitochondrial disease. So we need many people with many forms of mitochondrial disease. And importantly, as you said, not that you have to have a genetic diagnosis, you can be on the diagnostic journey, but we are more than happy to have Mitoshare serve as your community while you're moving through that diagnostic journey. Now, no doubt about it, if you have a confirmed genetic diagnosis, that opens up a lot of possibilities in terms of being able to participate in clinical studies, including clinical trials for investigational therapies. Danielle, I think one other aspect maybe we just want to touch on, again, it's not a register, create an account, write some information in there, and then go away. This is really a question of being able to remain engaged over time as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of how you said that this is a community that people can come and, feel supported, that there's somewhere that they can help this community, with research and just kind of collecting more information. So like Phil said, this is not a one and done. So we have patients fill out surveys and questionnaires within our registry. So they will do initial ones that kind of give a perspective of their symptoms, specific to them individually. And that allows us to kind of have a starting point. But it's also important that it's evolved, that we now do this annually. So we know that this disease may evolve or may stay in a maintenance phase. So it allows us to see the evolution of the diseases throughout a different patient perspective with each person.
Yeah, it's important to make the distinction, right, between sort of a one-time snapshot, if you will, and that this is an analogy we turn to quite often, right? Taking a picture represents a moment in time. But if we have many pictures strung together, right, across time, now the patient lived experience is being captured in a much more robust way. And I think the other aspect that we should emphasize here is that we recognize the burden that patients face, and these are energy disorders, and we've just talked a lot about fatigue. So there's an understanding that share what you can, what your body allows you to, what your disease allows you to, as you have time. And there may be times when you feel really energetic and are ready to put a lot of information in and participate in a more engaged way. There may be other times where you have to pull back just based on your own personal situation. This is fine. And you should never prevent you from being a part of the registry thinking, oh, there's no way I could do that here over time. I can't put that much time into it. Give as much time as you can, whatever level of engagement that you can accomplish given your disease. And we'll be really thankful for it, because we're generating incredibly important information, right, to inform research. And Danielle, maybe this is a good time to kind of talk about one of the clinical studies that we currently have active inside of Mitoshare called Merlin. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's a study that we've been conducting since fall of 2025. So it is a natural history study. So kind of a natural history study is a little bit different than a patient registry because we are following the natural evolution of a disease. So we're obviously looking for patients that have specific symptoms or conditions. So for this one, we are looking for mitochondrial disease patients that are experiencing fatigue and muscle weakness. So in this natural history study, there are different time intervals. It's every 3 months. We're having them complete questionnaires from their perspective, what we call patient-reported surveys. So it gives their perception of how their fatigue is, how their muscle weakness is, and then that allows us to collect that information. And as that has helped, like Magnus said, kind of use that information to develop outcomes and things like that in clinical trials to kind of see what areas we need to specifically work on.
Yeah, it's great to see this connection, right, to what's taking place in a clinical trial, right, outside of Mitoshare. That's a great place to try to develop complementary data, right, that might go alongside learnings within the clinical trial itself. We're going to share on screen a link to the UMDF webpage on active clinical research studies. I'm really excited about the capabilities we've added within Mitoshare to conduct natural history studies. So we have another study focused on POLG patients. We have this Merlin study right around a different set of patients. And we think there's every opportunity to do many more of these. And so now we're leveraging the investment we're making into the platform of a patient registry and trying to design more and more programming that can help more and more mitochondrial disease patients. So we're just at the very beginning of this. But it's an exciting time. And if ever you were on the sideline thinking about joining the registry, but not sure if there's really value to it, I think these studies that we're adding represent real value and can really make an impact in the therapeutic development space as well. So yeah, maybe we could touch upon that briefly, Magnus. So how do registry data impact therapeutic development?
Well, registry data and natural history data is really fundamental. It gives us a roadmap how to navigate. Without it, we really have to more make guesses and navigate a little bit more blindly. So one example is that For instance, Mitochondrial may give us really useful information for how common is specific types of symptoms, and the combination, how do they affect quality of life. But some of the specific studies that added these longitudinal studies that also had endpoints, then we will also know how specific measures develop over time. So all those components are critically important for when we design studies, but also to have as a comparator for the clinical study. So registries and natural history data is really fundamental to what we do, and they certainly strengthen any clinical development program.
Yeah, and it's really important that it's like a co-development, right? It's the patients helping an advocacy group like UMDF to design the registry, to what's important to them, how they can be involved with it, what they can and cannot accomplish, but also together with sponsors, right? That are developing therapeutics. What are the data that we can collect that are of greatest value to you in helping to assess ultimately whether an investigational therapy has benefit for mitochondrial disease? So it's very much a multi-stakeholder process, and that's the only way forward in terms of ensuring the value of patient registries. And really thankful for your participation in that aspect, Magnus. I think we've got to cover these three main areas now, right? So listening to the patient, how do we translate those listenings and learnings into research, and then participating in research. Maybe Christy, maybe you want to kind of quickly touch upon, even if a patient can't be involved in a clinical trial, how else can they contribute, right, overall to the advancement of research?
Yeah, a lot of times we hear patients say, I want to help. I want to be able to make some type of contribution. And they assume that maybe just because they're not eligible for a clinical trial, there's nothing they can do. But that's not true. Like we just heard Danielle speak about earlier. Being able to share your experiences and participating in those registries, completing surveys and questionnaires, they really do help researchers understand daily life. And I think most importantly, those are really meaningful contributions that help move further research forward. So anyone can participate and can help.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to put a plug in here for our annual mitochondrial medicine conference. Like, we're always looking for opportunities to create connections between the patient community, industry, researchers, and clinicians. And sometimes an offshoot of that are like separate discussions or focus groups. Even if it's just general networking, right? It brings a certain humanity to it all, that you understand that for the researchers, clinicians, industry, this is what mitochondrial disease patients look like and how they act and who they are. And for the patients, it's a recognition that these are people working very hard, right, to try to help them. And they need to understand, right, who you are. So there's many ways to participate, but if you have never been to one of our conferences, I'd really encourage you to join. We'll be in Philadelphia in June of 2027. So a pretty convenient location if you're in the Northeast or in the eastern side of the country. Please consider coming and joining the conversation. All right, so maybe in closing, I can just kind of toss it around here to each of the panelists. We've covered a lot of ground, right, across these sort of three main themes. But through all of it, all of this discussion, if you had to identify one thing, what gives you the most hope, right, for the future of mitochondrial disease research? And Christy, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think one of the big things that we're seeing, as we talked about earlier, is this real shift in how research is conducted. Patients are no longer viewed as just participants in the research. They're partners, and they truly are helping to shape that research. And I think the more that we can continue to listen to people living with mitochondrial disease and gather insights from them, like Magnus talked about earlier, it will help us ask better questions, design better studies, and ultimately really focus on those outcomes that matter most to the people living with mitochondrial disease.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. There's no question that this genuine partnership, right, with patients is a really important component of optimism for the future. Magnus, how about I throw it to you next?
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, to build further on that partnership, I mean, what really inspires me and gives me a lot of hope is to see the great collaboration between the different stakeholders here. I mean, patients, families, and patient advocacy groups, researchers, clinicians, and us from industry really coming together to solve these questions together. And I think it's that collective effort that will really bring us and move us forward.
Yeah, I really can't believe we've gone through this without using collaboration as a word anywhere through there. Maybe we have, but I think one of the things we've learned in mitochondrial disease, any disease, collection of diseases as complex as mitochondrial disease, no single organization, no single person can solve all the problems themselves. It's only through collaboration that we can effectively get to those treatments and cures that we all want for the mitochondrial disease patients. So thanks for calling that out, Magnus. All right, Danielle, I'll wrap up to you. What gives you the most hope for a positive future in mitochondrial disease research?
Yeah, so one thing I hope for our listeners is that they've taken away from today is that your voice is important, whether you give us 1 minute or 5 or participate, they're important. And I hope that we reiterate that to you today. And then for me, I think being in this community for almost a decade and seeing a couple of drugs get approved by the FDA and now seeing that there's been some approved for specific mitochondrial disease, I think I want people to know that I know that it's meaningful to the patients that are receiving them and their families, but as a research coordinator, I'm pretty involved with the people that are participate on a regular basis. So the excitement they get from participating or seeing the approvals, I feel just as excited because I'm just as invested, and these families are just as important to me. So it may seem individualized, but we are really all here and excited to provide these opportunities to people.
No, fantastic. Thanks to all of you for that. Let me try to pull it all together here in a few thoughts. First, one thing that really stood out to me from our conversation, all right, that research, good, valuable research, can't move forward in a single study or inside a single organization or even one type of data, right? So we need to be collecting a lot of different types of data, and that collaboration, right, is an important part of making that happen. Secondly, that if we listen carefully to patients, we can, in a much more effective way, convert their priorities into good scientific questions, which then inform the types of studies that we conduct, ensuring that we have the tools and the platforms to collect reliable information, and to do that over time so that we have sufficient data to be able to evaluate potential therapies going forward. And then importantly, that the patients and the families aren't like at the very end of the process and serving just as the potential beneficiaries of research. They're essential partners in crafting it and developing it and shaping it. And so I think that's come through in many of the conversations from today. Please know UMDF is 100% committed to helping bring these voices together, to bringing the stakeholders together, clinicians, researchers, patients, industry, so that science remains focused on patients and what matters most to the people living with mitochondrial disease. With that, I'm going to finish by thanking our panelists today, Christy, Magnus, Danielle. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. I think really valuable. Appreciate your making the time and meeting with us today. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who is listening, watching this podcast, and thank you for being a part of the mitochondrial disease community and certainly a part of the UMDF family. Goodbye for now. We hope you'll join us in a future UMDF podcast.
Thank you, Phil.